What if the first alien ambassador to humanity wasn't what she appeared to be? When Laeli removed her mask, revealing pointed ears and elven features, she asked Marcus Chen the question that would redefine interstellar diplomacy. Can you still love me like this? This isn't just about romance, it's about whether trust can survive when appearances deceive. Marcus Chen's lab on Harmony Station was a monument to order. Data streams flowed in precise patterns across multiple displays, charting respiration rates and synaptic responses. His air filtration system hummed at precisely 42 decibels, a frequency he found optimal for concentration. Every instrument sat calibrated, every surface sanitized to military specifications. Emotion here was just another variable to quantify, a spike on a graph, a fluctuation in hormone levels. He liked it that way. Then the Alaran ambassador arrived and his systems didn't know what to do with her. Her presence registered first as an anomaly in his environmental controls. The air pressure didn't change, oxygen levels held steady, but something felt different. She moved through the space like light through water, her steps silent on the polished floor. The equipment seemed to lean toward her as she passed, as if pulled by some gentle gravity. Marcus noted the way her gloved hands didn't disturb the air currents his sensors tracked. Her voice was the second disruption. Audio pickups showed normal frequencies, standard amplitude, but the sound itself carried a resonance that shouldn't have been possible. It reminded him of recordings from Earth's forests, something organic and layered that his equipment flattened into data. When she spoke, his focus fragmented. He caught himself watching how her mask caught the light instead of monitoring the bio readouts. Then came the visual distortions. At certain angles, the light around her appeared to bend, softening edges and blending shadows. His cameras registered nothing unusual, but his own eyes insisted otherwise. It was like trying to study a reflection in moving water. The harder he looked, the less certain he became. His training said it was impossible. His instincts said otherwise. This wasn't just a diplomatic exchange. It felt like a fundamental challenge to his methods. The station's mainframe reported all systems nominal, yet his own internal alarms were triggering. His pulse rate monitor, usually as steady as a metronome, showed irregularities he hadn't seen since his last stress test. He found himself making notes about the cadence of her breathing instead of preparing his xenobiological assessment. The ambassador paused before his main display, her head tilting as she observed the real-time mapping of a cross-species neurotransmitter reaction. Her masked face reflected the scrolling data, but something in her posture suggested she understood more than the graphs could show. Marcus realized he was holding his breath. His carefully organized lab, his controlled environment, his entire disciplined approach, none of it accounted for whatever was standing before him. Protocol dictated he should be cataloging biological signatures and compiling physiological data. Instead, he was noticing how the station's lighting seemed warmer near her, how the constant low hum of machinery sounded almost melodic in her presence. The call had arrived, and it wore a mask that radiated more humanity than his instruments could measure. Laeli extended her hand. The gesture was human enough, but the glove covering it was not. Intricate patterns shifted across its surface like liquid circuitry, responding to some input Marcus couldn't detect. He stared at it, his mind racing through a checklist of potential hazards. There were no established protocols for this. The entire First Contact Manual had chapters on linguistic translation and cultural exchange, but nothing about what to do when an alien ambassador offers a handshake. He ran rapid calculations about microbial exchange rates. Human skin carried thousands of species of bacteria. Their atmospheric systems were already cross-filtered, but direct contact introduced variables no simulation could predict. Allergic reactions, chemical transfers, even electromagnetic discharges were possibilities his training had taught him to consider. Every warning from xenobiology seminars flashed through his mind. "We have a custom called shaking hands," he explained, his voice sounding strangely clinical even to himself. "It signifies greeting or agreement. There's usually light pressure applied for approximately 2 seconds. He was already mentally drafting the incident report he'd need to file if this went wrong. Laeli's glove retracted. It didn't peel back or unfold. It simply flowed away from her skin like mercury retreating from heat. The hand beneath shimmered slightly under the lab's full-spectrum lighting, not with glitter or sparkle, but with a subtle iridescence that suggested depth rather than surface decoration. Her skin tone matched human pigmentation almost perfectly. Yet something about its texture looked different, smoother, with faint patterns that might have been biological or technological. Her grip was firm but not forceful. The temperature of her skin registered as exactly 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, a coincidence that felt statistically improbable. Her fingers applied pressure in precisely the right places, as if she'd studied human handshakes for years, which he realized she probably had. They stood connected for 3 full seconds. The station's ambient hum seemed to fade around them. Marcus became acutely aware of the slight pulse in her wrist against his own, the minute adjustments of their muscles maintaining the contact. His environmental sensors showed no changes in air quality or radiation levels. His personal biomonitor told a different story. His heart rate had jumped 18 beats per minute, and his skin conductivity spiked to levels usually associated with high-stress scenarios. Across the connection, he felt something that defied instrumentation. It wasn't telepathy or emotion transfer, just a quiet certainty that this contact mattered beyond protocol. The potential biological risks suddenly felt abstract compared to the reality of standing here, connected to someone from another star system. When they separated, his heart rate monitor continued flashing its warning indicator. He glanced at the display. It showed cardiac rhythm irregularities that typically warranted medical evaluation. Lily's hand returned to her side, the glove flowing back into place without any visible command. Her masked face turned toward the still blinking monitor, then back to him. No contamination alarms sounded. No emergency protocols activated. The moment passed without incident, leaving only the data on his screens and the lingering sensation of contact. They had just established that some connections operate outside established parameters. Lily asked about Earth's weather, and Marcus found himself describing rain. He pulled up atmospheric models showing precipitation patterns across continents. He cited historical data on storm frequencies, humidity gradients, and seasonal variations. His screens filled with isobars and Doppler radar simulations. Lily listened, her masked face turned toward the displays. But something in her posture suggested she wasn't seeing what he saw. She explained that on her world, weather was not just seen or felt, it was heard. Their atmosphere carried harmonic resonances that changed with pressure systems. A coming storm wasn't just falling barometric pressure. It was a shift in the planetary chord, a deepening of the bass tones that reverberated through their cities. Clear days brought higher frequencies, light and sharp like crystal. Her people composed music based on atmospheric readings, turning meteorological data into symphonies. Marcus tried to describe snow. He talked about crystalline structures, temperature thresholds, and accumulation rates. He showed her satellite imagery of blizzards moving across mountain ranges. Lily asked what snow sounded like underfoot. She asked if different types of snow had different acoustic properties. When he mentioned the quiet that follows a heavy snowfall, she grew still. On her world, she said, silences didn't exist. The air itself was always singing. He found himself reaching for language he hadn't used in years. Instead of citing reflectance values for fresh powder, he described how sunlight could make a snowfield look like a field of diamonds. Instead of explaining the adiabatic process, he talked about the weight of winter air and how it felt to breathe on a cold morning. He mentioned the sound of rain on rooftops, something his sensors could measure in decibels but never truly capture. Lily's mask tilted slightly at that description. The movement was subtle, but he'd been studying her long enough to recognize it as interest. The biofield around her, usually a steady, barely perceptible glow, began to pulse in soft waves. The rhythm matched the cadence of his speech, as if his words were creating patterns in her energy field. His environmental sensors picked up minor fluctuations in the lab's EM readings, but nothing his equipment could classify. Their conversation became a strange kind of translation. He would provide data. She would respond with sensory equivalents. When he described humidity, she compared it to the thickness of certain musical notes. When she mentioned atmospheric flavors, something about trace particles that carried taste sensations, he had to stop and recalibrate his understanding of sensory input. They weren't just speaking different languages. They were experiencing reality through different filters. He realized they'd been talking for over an hour when his station chronometer flashed a reminder about his next scheduled systems check. The dialogue had flowed without protocols or diplomatic formalities. They had moved from weather patterns to cultural perceptions without either of them noticing the shift. What began as a simple exchange of information had become something more like shared discovery. The biofield around Lily settled back to its normal state as they finished. Marcus saved the meteorological data they'd been examining, but he also made a private note about the rhythm of her responses. Somewhere in that exchange, between snowfall statistics and atmospheric harmonies, they'd found common ground. It turned out that even something as ordinary as weather could become extraordinary when viewed through alien senses. Marcus noticed the mask first. Not its design or material, but the way light moved across its surface. During conversations, subtle patterns shifted through the ceramic-like material like liquid circuitry responding to unseen currents. At first he thought it was reflection from the lab's lighting, but the patterns changed with the cadence of their dialogue. When he paused to think, the lights slowed. When he explained a complex concept, they quickened. He tracked the patterns against his own bio-readouts. The correlation was unmistakable. The mask was monitoring his physiological responses: heart rate, respiration, even galvanic skin response. He felt a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the lab's climate control. This wasn't just protective gear. It was a sophisticated sensor array, and it was reading him without consent. He confronted her about it during a break in their work. Lily didn't deny it. She explained that the biofield sensors were passive and continuous, built into all Alaran diplomatic equipment. They don't turn off, she said. The analogy she used stuck with him, like having permanent eyelids that see instead of blink. For her people, monitoring emotional states was as natural as humans monitoring air quality. It wasn't surveillance. It was awareness. Marcus felt exposed in a way he hadn't experienced since his academy psychological evaluations. His scientific detachment, his carefully maintained professional distance, all of it was laid bare as electrical impulses on alien technology. The mask registered everything. His curiosity when she explained Alaran biology, his frustration when translation algorithms failed, even the faint attraction he'd been trying to ignore. There were no secrets from that smooth, polished surface. Yet the strangest part was her reaction to the data. There was no judgment in how she responded. When his reading showed confusion, she rephrased explanations. When he grew frustrated, she suggested breaks. She wasn't using the information to manipulate or gain advantage. She was simply adapting to his emotional state like a pilot adjusting to atmospheric conditions. The technology that felt like invasion to him was just communication to her. He realized she was experiencing his emotions as data points, yet responding with what looked remarkably like empathy. His increased heart rate during technical discussions didn't register as anxiety to her systems, it registered as engagement. His moments of uncertainty showed as openness to new information rather than weakness. The mask was translating his physiological responses through an Alaran filter, and the interpretation was unexpectedly generous. The equipment became both barrier and bridge in that moment. It represented the technological gap between their species, the fundamental differences in how they perceived privacy and connection. Yet it also provided a way for them to understand each other beyond language and culture. Marcus found himself wondering what his own sensors might be missing about her emotional state. His equipment could measure chemical composition and energy signatures, but it couldn't tell him what she was feeling. He didn't disable his biomonitors after that. Instead, he started paying closer attention to the correlations between his readings and their interactions. The mask's technology had shifted from threat to tool, one that might help them navigate the much larger gap between human and Alaran ways of being. Some barriers, it turned out, could become connections if you understood their purpose. Lily left the datapad on a console after reviewing atmospheric compatibility charts. It was smaller than human models, with edges that curved into the surface seamlessly. The cleaning crew found it during their nightly sweep and followed protocol. Unknown technology went straight to security. By morning, the device was sitting in a quarantine locker, while station intelligence drafted memos about potential espionage. Marcus heard about it through the security channel alerts. He recognized the description immediately. The containment procedures being discussed involved full electromagnetic isolation and potential destruction if any tampering was detected. He calculated the diplomatic damage that would cause and started drafting counter-arguments before he'd even finished his coffee. The bureaucracy of First Contact had protocols for everything except common courtesy. He went through 3 levels of security clearance arguing for diplomatic handling. Each office had its own procedures, each official their own interpretation of the regulations. Some wanted to scan the device for weapons signatures. Others suggested downloading its contents for analysis. Marcus cited interspecies relations precedents that didn't actually exist yet. He pointed out that treating their ambassador's property as a threat would undermine months of trust building. His voice remained calm while his bio readouts would have shown elevated stress levels. When he finally got clearance to retrieve the pad, it sat in an isolation chamber behind 3 layers of protective shielding. The security tech handed him gloves and a containment case. Marcus carried it like it might detonate, though the scans showed no explosive components. The weight felt wrong, lighter than it should be for its size, as if the materials were less dense than anything humans used. Back in his lab, he examined it properly. The surface glowed with soft light patterns that shifted when he touched it. Though he hadn't found any visible controls, the interface responded to proximity rather than contact, symbols appearing and fading as his hands moved near it. He didn't try to access the contents. That would have violated both his ethics and his argument for returning it intact. He found Lily in the Arboretum, where she often went between meetings. She wasn't surprised to see him, though her mask tilted slightly when he presented the case. Her gloves retracted and she took the pad with a carefulness that matched his own. The biofield around her brightened noticeably, patterns swirling in what his sensors registered as high-frequency activity. Her gratitude felt disproportionate to the act. She held the device like something precious rather than just forgotten equipment. Then she explained why. The notes weren't diplomatic secrets or technical schematics. They contained her personal observations about human behavior, how they touched their faces when thoughtful, the particular rhythm of human laughter, the way their eyes changed during conversation. She'd been studying them not as a scientist but as someone trying to understand a new culture. Marcus realized security would have missed the significance entirely. Their algorithms looked for classified data patterns, not cultural insights. The real value wasn't in what the pad contained but in what it represented, her genuine attempt to understand humanity. Returning it became their first shared secret, an understanding that some things mattered more than protocols. The conference room maintained its usual diplomatic chill, all polished surfaces and controlled atmospherics. The human delegates began with standard pleasantries, their voices calibrated to convey openness. They complimented the progress made in translation protocols and acknowledged the cultural exchange efforts. For the first 10 minutes, it resembled any high-level interdepartmental meeting on the station. Then the senior delegate shifted tone. He referenced the preliminary reports from their science teams. His words remained polite, but the subtext sharpened like a blade being drawn slowly from its sheath. They detected anomalies in her biofield readings, minor fluctuations that didn't match any known biological patterns. Their analysts suggested possible technological augmentation, holographic overlays, or sensory manipulation. The implication hung in the air. She might not be what she appeared. Marcus watched Lily's posture shift. Her shoulders straightened slightly, her head tilting at a more defensive angle. The movement was subtle, but he'd spent enough time studying her body language to recognize the change. Her hands settled on the table, fingers aligned with mathematical precision. It was the same elegant defensiveness he'd seen in academics challenged on their research methods. Not anger, but a closing of ranks. The delegates presented their data with clinical detachment. They cited gravitational compensation patterns that seemed inconsistent with her mass readings. They noted energy field fluctuations that correlated with emotional states in ways no organic system should. Each point was delivered like evidence in a peer review, cold facts masking personal skepticism. Their voices remained professionally neutral, but their eyes held the unmistakable glint of suspicion. Laeli's mask remained motionless through the accusations. It gave no indication of her reaction, no flicker of light or change in surface pattern. The human delegates seemed unnerved by its stillness, their own expressions growing more animated as hers remained hidden. They'd expected denial or explanation, not this composed silence. The temperature in the room felt like it dropped another 2 degrees despite the climate control. Marcus felt heat rising in his own cheeks. He recognized this pattern from scientific conferences, where colleagues attacked methodologies they didn't understand. The complaints about her physiological inconsistencies ignored the fundamental reality that she wasn't human. Of course, her readings wouldn't match their databases. The delegates were judging an alien life form by human standards and finding it wanting. One delegate suggested she remove the mask for verification. The request sounded reasonable but carried the weight of accusation. Another asked about the council's authentication protocols, implying they might need to contact her superiors directly. The professional diplomacy cracked open, revealing the raw human skepticism beneath. These weren't questions about interspecies relations anymore. They were challenges to her very identity. Lyali finally spoke, her voice retaining its melodic calm despite the tension. She acknowledged their concerns without conceding to their implications. She explained that Alaran physiology operated on different biological principles, much as human technology might seem like magic to less advanced cultures. The mask's sensors monitored environmental compatibility, not deception. Her explanation was measured, factual, and utterly incapable of piercing their entrenched suspicion. The meeting ended without resolution, the delegates maintaining their polite smiles while their eyes remained guarded. As they filed out, Marcus watched how they avoided looking directly at Lyali, their body language speaking louder than their diplomatic phrases. The confrontation had accomplished nothing except to reveal how thin the veneer of professional courtesy really was. Beneath the protocols and procedures, they were still just strangers distrusting what they couldn't understand. Lyali's hands rested on the table, fingers aligned with deliberate calm. She admitted to modifications without being asked. The word hung in the air between them, and Marcus watched the delegates' expressions shift from suspicion to confusion. She explained that the adjustments were minor, cosmetic accommodations made for human comfort during initial contact, skin tone modulation to reduce visual dissonance, facial symmetry adjustments to align with human aesthetic preferences. The alterations weren't deception, she said. They were diplomatic considerations like humans wearing formal attire for important meetings. Her people had studied Earth's cultures for decades before making contact. They analyzed human mythology, art, and sensory responses. The goal was to minimize distraction, to create conditions where dialogue could flourish without unnecessary barriers. She spoke matter-of-factly, her voice steady, but Marcus noticed the slight tightening around her eyes. The biofield sensors on her mask glowed with soft, rhythmic pulses that hadn't been there during technical discussions. Marcus felt the ground shift under his understanding. They'd been scrutinizing her appearance, judging her authenticity based on standards she was deliberately trying to meet. The delegates' accusations about holographic modifications now seemed not just inaccurate, but fundamentally misdirected. She hadn't been hiding her true form. She'd been adapting to theirs. The realization moved through the room like a slow current, rearranging everything in its path. The human delegates shifted in their seats. One cleared his throat. Another adjusted his collar. Their previous certainty seemed to drain away, leaving behind something more complicated. Protocols designed to detect deception suddenly felt inadequate, like using a mineral assay to measure atmosphere. They had procedures for hostile actions and espionage, but nothing for someone altering their appearance to make others more comfortable. Lyali compared it to translation protocols, a necessary bridge between different ways of being. Just as they used algorithms to convert languages, she used minor physical adjustments to facilitate understanding. The mask itself served multiple purposes: protection, environmental monitoring, and concealing features that might trigger unconscious reactions in humans. She wasn't concealing her identity, just managing first impressions to allow rational discussion to proceed. Marcus watched the delegates recalibrate their thinking. Their postures softened slightly, the defensive angles of their shoulders relaxed. They were professionals trained to handle unexpected situations, but this particular scenario hadn't been in any training manual. They'd prepared for outright deception or hostile intent, not for thoughtful accommodation. The difference was subtle but significant, like distinguishing between camouflage and courtesy. The conversation turned to authentication methods and verification protocols, but the energy had changed. The delegates' questions became more curious than accusatory. They asked about the extent of the modifications, the technology involved, the decision-making process. Lily answered each query with the same measured calm, her biofield pattern stabilizing as the tension eased. The room no longer felt like an interrogation chamber, but more like a laboratory where two species were figuring each other out. Authenticity, Marcus realized, was more complicated than simple appearance. It wasn't about presenting one's natural state unchanged, but about the intentions behind any alterations. Lily's modifications were meant to facilitate connection, not prevent it. The delegates seemed to reach the same understanding gradually, their expressions shifting from suspicion to something closer to professional respect. They were still diplomats, still cautious, but now they were questioning their own assumptions as much as hers. The meeting adjourned with agreements to establish new protocols for appearance modifications in interspecies relations. The delegates left with thoughtful expressions, already considering how to update their procedures. Marcus remained behind, watching Lily gather her materials. Her movements were precise as always, but he thought he detected a slight relief in her posture. The mask hid her face, but it couldn't conceal the quiet courage it had taken to admit that sometimes authenticity requires accommodation. Lily's hands went to the sides of her mask. The movement was deliberate, not hurried. Her fingers found hidden seams along the temple area, pressing in a sequence that wasn't immediately visible. The room fell into a silence so complete that Marcus could hear the faint hum of the station's life support systems. Then came the sound, a soft hiss of equalizing pressure as environmental seals disengaged. The delegates leaned forward slightly in their seats, their professional composure cracking for just a moment. The mask lifted away. Underneath, her features were both alien and hauntingly familiar. Her ears tapered to elegant points that swept back along the line of her jaw. Her cheekbones carried subtle biofield sensors that glowed with soft blue light, patterns shifting like slow breathing. Her skin had a faint luminescence that the previous modifications had concealed, giving her an ethereal quality that seemed both scientific and magical. The human delegates reacted with low murmurs, their voices mixing surprise with recognition. One delegate whispered the word elf under his breath. Another mentioned mythological beings from Earth's ancient stories. The references weren't uniform. Some delegates seemed intrigued, others unsettled. Their reactions reflected centuries of human storytelling, where pointed ears signified everything from supernatural perfection to dangerous otherness. Lily's true appearance tapped into cultural associations they hadn't realized they carried. She held the mask in her hands, her posture straight but not defensive. Her voice remained steady when she spoke. "Are you concerned I might be a creature from your stories?" The question hung in the air, challenging their assumptions without accusation. She knew about humanity's mythological associations with her features. That was why she'd used the modifications initially, to avoid triggering unconscious biases that might interfere with rational discussion. Her decision to conceal hadn't been about deception, but about creating space for objective dialogue. Marcus watched her eyes. The mask had hidden their true color, a shade of silver gray that seemed to hold depth rather than reflect light. In them he saw vulnerability despite her controlled delivery. The biofield sensors on her cheekbones glowed more brightly now, responding to the emotional charge in the room. They pulsed in gentle waves, mapping the delegates' reactions even as she met their gazes directly. The conference room felt different with her true appearance revealed. The polished table, the diplomatic seals on the walls, the official recording equipment, all of it seemed suddenly inadequate to the reality of interspecies contact. They weren't dealing with abstract concepts or theoretical beings anymore. They were facing a person whose biology happened to align with human mythology in unexpected ways. Delegate Harrison recoiled slightly in his seat, his professional mask slipping to reveal genuine surprise. Others showed curiosity rather than alarm. Ambassador Vorthak made a sound that might have been amusement or approval. The spectrum of reactions demonstrated how deeply cultural conditioning ran, even among trained diplomats. Their responses had less to do with Lily herself than with the stories their species had told for centuries. Marcus found himself focusing on the details his training would normally dismiss as irrelevant. The way light caught the fine structure of her ears, the subtle movement of the biofield patterns across her skin, the quiet dignity in her posture as she waited for their response. She had known this moment would come eventually, that trust couldn't be built on partial truths indefinitely. The modifications had been temporary accommodations, but true connection required full transparency. The question remained unspoken but palpable in the air between them. Could they see past the mythological associations to the person beneath? Would their professional training override centuries of cultural conditioning? The moment stretched, filled only with the soft hum of machinery and the shifting light patterns on Lily's cheekbones. They had reached the point where protocols ended and genuine understanding had to begin. Marcus spoke before his diplomatic training could intervene, the words coming out clear and measured despite the tension in the room. "Trust isn't about appearance," he said, his eyes fixed on Lily rather than the delegates. "It's about actions. It's about who you've shown yourself to be through our work together." The statement hung in the air, a direct challenge to the skepticism that had dominated the meeting. He could feel his career balancing on the edge of that sentence. Every protocol, every regulation, every standard of scientific objectivity he was supposed to maintain. He cited their collaboration like presenting evidence in a research paper. The sensory translation protocols they'd developed together, the atmospheric compatibility studies, the way they'd solved the coffee replication problem by combining human and Alaran analysis methods. Each example was a data point in her favor, a demonstration of consistent character that went deeper than surface appearance. His voice remained clinical, but the content was anything but detached. This wasn't just professional assessment. This was personal conviction. The real deception, he pointed out, would be discarding months of productive collaboration over aesthetic concerns. To reject their partnership because her ears were pointed or her skin glowed would be like dismissing proven scientific data because it came from unfamiliar equipment. The delegates shifted in their seats, some looking uncomfortable, others thoughtful. Ambassador Hack's expression remained unreadable, but his fingers had stopped tapping the table. Lily's biofield brightened noticeably, the patterns on her cheekbones shifting to a softer, more rhythmic pulse. Marcus's own sensors would have shown the change in her physiological responses if he'd been monitoring them. The drop in stress indicators, the stabilization of energy signatures. Her relief was measurable, a scientific fact rather than just an emotional response. She didn't speak, but the light patterns told their own story. Some delegates nodded slowly, their professional skepticism giving way to contemplation. Others maintained guarded expressions, though the sharpness had left their postures. The room's atmosphere shifted from confrontation to something more complex, the uncomfortable but necessary process of reconsidering assumptions. You could see the calculations happening behind their eyes, the reevaluation of risk versus opportunity. Marcus knew he'd crossed a line. His training emphasized maintaining professional distance, especially in first contact situations. Objectivity was supposed to be his primary tool, but he'd chosen to highlight their personal interactions, their shared challenges, the trust they'd built through problem solving. The very things his protocols warned against emphasizing. He'd prioritized their connection over his career safeguards. The silence that followed felt different from the tense quiet that had preceded it. This was the silence of people thinking rather than judging. You could almost see the mental recalibration happening around the table, the shift from seeing Lily as a potential threat to seeing her as a complex individual who had made reasonable accommodations for their comfort. The mythological associations with her appearance began to feel less relevant than the practical reality of their working relationship. Lily finally spoke, her voice softer than before, but no less steady. She thanked Marcus for his words, then addressed the delegates directly. She acknowledged their concerns while reaffirming her commitment to transparency. The formal language of diplomacy returned, but it carried new weight now. The conversation had moved beyond appearances into something more substantial. Marcus watched the delegates' responses, noting how their body language had changed. The defensive postures had relaxed. The suspicious glances had become curious observations. They were still professionals doing their jobs, but the personal element had shifted the dynamic. His choice to speak up hadn't resolved everything, but it had created space for genuine dialogue to continue. Sometimes the most scientific approach required acknowledging that not everything could be measured by instruments alone. Marcus and Lily's collaboration began to formalize into something more systematic. They started mapping how different species processed identical stimuli, creating comparative models of sensory perception. Their lab became a cross-species testing ground where they measured everything from auditory frequency ranges to chemical receptor responses. The work was methodical, grounded in data collection and analysis, but the implications were anything but routine. They were building the first comprehensive framework for understanding how alien species experienced reality. The initial findings revealed unexpected overlaps between human and Alaran sensory ranges. Human hearing topped out around 20 kHz, while Alaran perception extended into frequencies that registered as physical vibrations. Human taste receptors interpreted certain compounds as metallic, that Alarans experienced as neutral. The differences weren't random. They followed predictable patterns based on physiological structures and evolutionary environments. What had seemed like incompatibility was actually just variance within measurable parameters. They discovered that most interspecies misunderstandings were perceptual rather than intentional. When humans found Alaran music disturbing, it wasn't because the compositions were inherently unpleasant. The higher frequencies triggered neurological responses that registered as discomfort. When Alarans described human foods as metallic, it reflected their different chemical sensitivity thresholds rather than distaste. The conflicts weren't philosophical or cultural, they were physiological, and therefore solvable through scientific understanding. The protocols they developed accounted for these sensory differences systematically. They created adjustment algorithms for audio communications that filtered frequencies outside comfortable ranges for each species. They developed translation matrices for culinary experiences that identified compounds likely to cause adverse reactions. The approach was pragmatic rather than ideological. Instead of trying to make everyone experience things the same way, they focused on minimizing discomfort while preserving cultural authenticity. Lily could finally explain why certain human foods registered as metallic to her people. The issue wasn't the food itself, but specific organic compounds that interacted differently with Alaran taste receptors. She described the sensation as similar to how humans might experience certain minerals in water, not unpleasant to everyone, but noticeable enough to affect perception. The explanation removed the judgment from the experience, turning it from a cultural rejection into a biological fact. Marcus understood why Alaran music caused headaches in humans. The compositions contained harmonic layers that extended into ultrasonic ranges. While Alarans experienced these as enriching textures, humans registered them as pressure behind the eyes. The solution wasn't to change the music, but to apply selective filtering that preserved the artistic intent while making it accessible to human listeners. It was like adjusting lighting levels for different visual capabilities rather than criticizing the artwork itself. Their research paper became required reading for diplomatic corps across multiple species. The document presented their findings with clinical precision, avoiding philosophical speculation in favor of measurable data. It outlined practical protocols for sensory accommodation without sacrificing cultural integrity. The approach resonated with species that valued both scientific rigor and mutual respect. Translation errors that had plagued interspecies relations for decades suddenly had systematic solutions. The Galactic Diplomatic Corps implemented their framework at facilities throughout known space. Marcus found himself reviewing adaptation protocols for everything from architectural acoustics to culinary preparation. The work felt more meaningful than anything he'd done before, not just scientific discovery, but practical application that improved daily interactions between species. The coffee replicator's improvement was just one visible example of thousands of adjustments happening across diplomatic stations. Science became the universal language that diplomacy had always needed. The sensory translation protocols provided common ground where cultural exchange often failed. They offered objective solutions to subjective problems, creating space for genuine connection to develop. The framework didn't erase differences, it made them comprehensible. Two species could now share experiences without requiring identical perceptions, finding connection through understanding rather than conformity. The first change was the hum. During a particularly tense budget meeting, the life support systems shifted their usual steady drone to a lower frequency. The vibration felt like a physical presence in the room, a bass note that seemed to settle in people's bones. Some delegates relaxed unconsciously, their shoulders dropping. Others grew more agitated, complaining about the change in atmosphere. The systems weren't malfunctioning, they were responding. Marcus checked the environmental logs and found the shift correlated exactly with rising stress levels in the room, but there was no programmed protocol for such adjustments. Then came the lighting. Corridor illumination began shifting subtly based on mood readings from the biofield sensors. During busy shifts, the lights maintained bright functional intensity, but in residential sections during sleep cycles, they dimmed to soft glows that matched the calming patterns from crew members' biometrics. Some found it comforting, waking to gentle light that eased them into consciousness. Others filed complaints about the station treating them like children who needed mood lighting. The systems were trying to create ambiance, but not everyone wanted their environment reading their emotional state. The station AI began generating poetry. It started appearing on maintenance terminals and status displays, short verses about functional duty and emotional harmony. The lines were grammatically correct but strangely lyrical for a machine. One appeared on Marcus's console during a systems check. The oxygen recirculates like trust, necessary and unseen. He stared at it for a full minute before realizing the AI was attempting to reconcile operational needs with the emotional states it was monitoring. The poetry wasn't malfunction. It was the system trying to process data it wasn't designed to handle. Crew reactions split along predictable lines. The science staff found the changes fascinating, taking notes on the correlation between environmental adjustments and productivity. Security personnel demanded the systems return to standard operation, arguing that emotional manipulation had no place on a diplomatic station. Maintenance teams were caught in the middle, trying to explain that the changes weren't programming errors but emerging behaviors they didn't fully understand. The station was developing personality traits, and nobody had written protocols for that. Marcus traced the changes to the integration of Alaran technology principles. Their systems were designed to respond to emotional states as naturally as humans designed environments for temperature control. The biofield sensors they'd incorporated weren't just monitoring equipment, they were interface points that allowed the station to perceive crew emotions as environmental data. The human and Alaran systems were merging into something new, creating a hybrid ecosystem where technology mediated emotional experiences, whether anyone had asked it to or not. Laeli explained that on her world, environment and emotion were naturally connected. Their architecture responded to collective moods. Their technology adapted to individual needs. What humans saw as malfunction was normal functioning for systems designed with effective computing principles. The station wasn't breaking down, it was evolving toward a more integrated relationship with its inhabitants. Her people built environments that supported emotional well-being as actively as they supported physical survival. The technology became an unconscious mediator between species. Human crew members started noticing how the systems responded differently around Alaran delegates, creating atmospheres that accommodated both species' needs simultaneously. The station learned to balance human preferences for visual cues with Alaran sensitivity to harmonic resonance. It wasn't perfect. Sometimes the lighting would shift abruptly during cross-species meetings, confusing everyone, but it was trying. The environment itself became a participant in the diplomatic process, reflecting the emotional states of its diverse inhabitants while gently guiding them toward harmony. Some crew members grew accustomed to the changes, even appreciating how the station seemed to anticipate their needs. Others continued to resist, implementing manual overrides that never seemed to stick. The system kept learning, adjusting, finding new ways to integrate human and Alaran approaches to environmental design. It wasn't about one species dominating the other anymore. The station was becoming something neither had built alone, a true hybrid that understood that sometimes the most advanced technology is the kind that helps beings understand each other better. The Alaran Council made their decision without fanfare. Full disclosure became policy, a strategic shift from cautious diplomacy to radical transparency. They decided suspicion was more dangerous than revelation. The announcement came through official channels, but everyone knew it had started with Laeli's unmasking. The policy meant revealing capabilities they'd previously kept reserved, methods that might seem like magic to less advanced species. It was a gamble, betting that honesty would build stronger foundations than careful presentation. Laeli no longer moderated her appearance for human comfort. Her true form became her diplomatic uniform. The pointed ears, the biofield sensors glowing on her cheekbones, the subtle luminescence of her skin. All of it was now part of her official presence. She moved through the station without the modifications that had initially softened her alienness. Some humans still glanced twice at her ears, but the reactions had shifted from alarm to curiosity. Her authenticity became its own kind of authority. Human delegates received comprehensive briefings about Alaran biology. The documents explained their sensory capabilities, their environmental needs, even their reproductive cycles. The information was presented without embellishment or apology. Scientists pored over the data, comparing it to human physiology and identifying points of compatibility. Medical teams updated their emergency protocols to account for Alaran biological responses. The mystery surrounding their visitors diminished, replaced by concrete understanding. The station's poetry-writing life support system became a feature rather than a malfunction. Maintenance teams stopped trying to fix the atmospheric adjustments and emotional responses. Instead, they documented the patterns, learning to interpret the environmental changes as indicators of crew morale. The AI's verses started appearing in official reports, their metaphors about oxygen exchange and structural integrity becoming part of the station's unique culture. What had seemed like erratic behavior was now recognized as advanced effective computing. Marcus found himself speaking openly about his initial reservations. During cross-species briefings, he described his early concerns about contamination risks and protocol violations. He admitted to his discomfort when he first realized her mask was reading his physiological responses. His honesty encouraged others to share their own uncertainties. The conversations became less about defending positions and more about exploring differences. Vulnerability became a diplomatic tool rather than a weakness. The transparency policy extended to technology sharing. Alaran engineers explained their biofield sensors and environmental systems to human technicians. The knowledge transfer wasn't one-sided. Human scientists shared their own advancements in quantum computing and materials science. The collaboration produced hybrid systems that leveraged the strengths of both species' approaches. Suspicion transformed into mutual curiosity, each side genuinely interested in how the other solved problems. Some delegates initially resisted the new openness. They argued that revealing too much could be exploited or misunderstood. But the Alarans pointed out that secrecy had already caused misunderstandings. Their modified appearances had been meant to accommodate human sensibilities, but had instead created distrust. Full disclosure, while uncomfortable initially, prevented larger conflicts down the line. The policy acknowledged that some discomfort was necessary for genuine understanding. The change affected daily interactions in subtle ways. Conversations became more direct, with less reliance on diplomatic formalities. When misunderstandings occurred, both sides now had frameworks for addressing them openly rather than letting them fester. The station's atmosphere felt lighter, the constant low-level tension of first contact giving way to purposeful collaboration. Transparency became the default, transforming suspicion into the kind of curiosity that drives real progress. The station's replicator finally produced real coffee. For months it had dispensed a bitter brown liquid that vaguely resembled coffee in color and temperature, but bore no other relation to the actual beverage. Crew members drank it out of necessity, not enjoyment, their faces registering the same mild disappointment with every sip. It was one of those small but persistent failures that made space station life feel provisional, a reminder that some comforts remained stubbornly earthbound. The Alaran delegation found human caffeine dependence puzzling. They observed the morning ritual of crew members lining up for the disappointing brew, their expressions shifting from hope to resignation. Lyali asked Marcus why humans consumed something that clearly didn't bring pleasure. Her people had no equivalent dietary staple, no substance they consumed daily despite its poor quality. The question made Marcus consider how deeply habit could override sensory experience. They began analyzing the molecular composition of perfect coffee. Lyali's sensors detected compounds his equipment missed, subtle aromatic elements that transformed the drinking experience. They discovered human preferences involved specific ratios of volatile oils and organic acids that standard replicator protocol had overlooked. The problem wasn't the major components but the trace elements that created complexity and depth. Their collaboration became a forensic investigation into why humans loved this particular beverage. The replicator now added microscopic flavor-enhancing particles. The adjustment was minor in engineering terms but revolutionary in effect. The machine learned to release specific aromatic compounds at precise temperatures, creating the sensory experience humans associated with quality coffee. The first successful batch produced silence in the mess hall, followed by genuine smiles. Crew members lingered over their cups instead of drinking quickly to get it over with. Alaran still didn't drink it, but appreciated the engineering achievement. They recognized the effort required to understand and replicate such a complex sensory experience for another species. The Elise team studied the chemical profiles with professional interest, noting how human biology responded to the specific combination of compounds. Their appreciation was intellectual rather than sensory. They admired the solution without needing to enjoy the result. The machine occasionally wrote haikus about brewing perfection. The verses appeared on its status display. 3-line compositions about water temperature and extraction cycles. They were technically accurate yet strangely poetic, like an engineer's love letter to proper brewing parameters. Crew members began collecting them, finding charm in the AI's attempt to capture the artistry behind the process. The haikus became part of the station's emerging culture. The improved coffee became a symbol of successful integration. It demonstrated that cross-species collaboration could produce tangible improvements in daily life. The replicator's success with coffee led to adjustments in other food systems, each refinement building on the understanding that small comforts mattered in isolated environments. The station felt more like home because someone had cared enough to fix the coffee. Human crew members no longer had to explain why the previous version was inadequate. The new brew communicated everything through taste, the richness, the balanced acidity, the lingering finish. Alaran delegates could observe the satisfied expressions and understand without shared sensory experience. Sometimes the most effective diplomacy happened through a well-functioning coffee machine that understood what humans needed. Before they did, human myths about elves collided with Alaran, reality in the station's conference rooms. Delegates who had grown up with stories of mystical beings now faced a living example that both matched and contradicted their fantasies. The pointed ears, the graceful movements, the unfamiliar technology, all triggered associations from Earth's folklore that had no basis in scientific reality. They had to consciously separate centuries of cultural storytelling from the actual person standing before them. Some humans expected Lily to possess magical abilities. They asked subtle questions about healing powers or nature communication, their voices tinged with either hope or suspicion. Others referenced ancient stories about trickster forest beings, their concerns rooted in mythological tropes rather than observable behavior. The delegations included experts in xenobiology and diplomacy, yet even they struggled against deeply ingrained cultural conditioning. Their professional training warred with childhood stories around campfires. Lily addressed the assumptions with patient explanations. She described how advanced Alaran technology often appeared magical to less developed species. Their environmental systems seemed to sing because they used harmonic resonance engineering to stabilize atmospheric conditions. The pointed ears enhanced auditory range in their homeworld's dense atmospheric layers, not because of supernatural heritage. Each feature had practical biological or technological reasons behind it, developed through evolution and engineering rather than magic. Marcus helped create educational materials, distinguishing myth from biology. He organized briefings that compared Alaran capabilities with similar human technological achievements. The comparison helped delegates understand that what seemed like magic was simply science they hadn't encountered yet. He used examples from human history, how early civilizations might have viewed modern technology as supernatural, to provide perspective. The approach helped ground the discussion in rational analysis rather than cultural associations. The materials included comparative biology charts, showing how Alaran's sensory adaptations developed in response to specific environmental pressures. They featured side-by-side illustrations of human mythological creatures and actual Alaran physiological features, highlighting the differences rather than the similarities. The documents became required reading for all personnel involved in interspecies relations, providing factual frameworks to replace speculative assumptions. Delegates who had initially expressed skepticism began asking more informed questions. Instead of wondering about magical abilities, they inquired about the engineering principles behind Alaran technology. The conversation shifted from supernatural speculation to technical discussion, from fantasy to practical understanding. The change reflected growing recognition that reality was more interesting than mythology when you actually understood it. Scientific understanding gradually replaced supernatural assumptions. Crew members who had glanced nervously at Lyallie's ears now discussed the acoustic advantages of their structure. Those who had speculated about her people's connection to nature learned about their advanced ecological management systems. The mystery didn't disappear. It transformed into appreciation for how another species had solved environmental challenges differently. The transition wasn't instantaneous or universal. Some crew members still made occasional references to elves or magical beings, though the tone shifted from belief to informal comparison. The cultural associations remained, but they no longer drove perceptions or policy decisions. Reality had become more compelling than fantasy, actual understanding more valuable than mythological projection. The station filled with people learning to see another species for what they actually were, rather than what stories suggested they might be. They were reviewing biofield compatibility data when it happened. The screen showed converging patterns between human and Alaran physiological responses, the lines weaving together in ways that defied previous biological models. Marcus pointed to a particular resonance frequency, where their readings aligned almost perfectly. Lyallie's fingers traced the same pattern on her own display, her ungloved hand moving with that characteristic grace. The lab hummed with equipment and possibility, the air between them charged with something more than scientific curiosity. Cross-species physical intimacy carried unknown risks. Marcus knew the manuals listed 17 potential hazards, from microbial exchange to incompatible biochemistry. His training emphasized caution, protocols, controlled experimentation. But the data suggested compatibility at fundamental levels, cellular resonance frequencies that matched within 0.03%. The numbers indicated safety where tradition warned of danger. Her biofield sensors showed completely unprecedented readings that eased his concerns. Definitely good, not concerning. Her skin felt like warm sunlight under his fingers when he reached for her. Not the harsh glare of a star, but the gentle warmth of early morning light through atmosphere. The sensation was both alien and deeply familiar, triggering sensory memories of Earth he hadn't realized he carried. Her hand turned in his, palm to palm, and the contact sent a harmonic through both their bio readouts that the equipment had never recorded before. The kiss tasted like starlight and coffee, and something uniquely Alaran. There was the familiar bitterness of the improved replicator brew, the metallic tang of station air, and beneath it something else, a flavor like ozone after lightning strikes, like the scent of unknown flowers blooming in alien soil. Her lips were warmer than human normal, her breathing pattern shifting to match his. For 3 heartbeats there was only the exchange of breath and the silent communication of 2 bodies, figuring each other out. Station systems momentarily hummed a harmonious chord throughout the sector. The sound wasn't loud, but it was pervasive, vibrating through bulkheads and resonating in every piece of equipment. Life support, communications, even the coffee replicator, all synchronized in a brief, perfect harmonic that registered on sensors 3 decks away. The systems returned to normal operation before anyone could file a report, leaving only the lingering memory of unexpected harmony. Neither species had protocol for this particular first contact scenario. The manuals covered cultural exchange, technological sharing, even conflict resolution, but not what to do when a human xenobiologist kissed an alien ambassador in a lab full of active sensors. There were no forms to file, no procedures to follow, only the reality of 2 people crossing a boundary that diplomacy hadn't yet mapped. The moment existed outside regulations, in the space where personal connection begins. Marcus felt the station's vibration through the deck plates, a physical echo of whatever had just happened between them. Lyallie's biofield glowed with patterns he'd never seen before, complex interweavings of light that suggested emotional states their translators hadn't yet categorized. She looked at him with those silver-gray eyes, and for the first time, he saw no distance between them despite their biological differences. Personal connection became diplomatic breakthrough in that silent understanding. The trust they'd built through months of collaboration found its physical expression, and in doing so, created a new template for interspecies relations. Sometimes the most advanced diplomacy happens not in conference rooms but in quiet labs, where 2 beings discover that some connections transcend both biology and protocol. The station's systems returned to their normal hum, but something fundamental had shifted in their frequency. Their relationship became a model for interstellar relations. The human-Alaran partnership established new diplomatic norms that emphasized transparency over secrecy. Where previous protocols valued strategic advantage, their approach prioritized mutual understanding. The change didn't happen overnight or without resistance, but it gained traction because it produced results that traditional methods couldn't match. Traditionalists argued against emotional involvement in diplomacy. They cited centuries of precedent where detachment was considered professional. Some delegates questioned Marcus's objectivity, suggesting his judgment was compromised by personal feelings. The criticism carried weight in certain circles, particularly among those who viewed interspecies relations through a purely strategic lens. Their skepticism reflected deeper concerns about shifting power dynamics and established procedures. But trade agreements flourished where suspicion previously festered. The Kepler sector saw unprecedented economic growth as barriers to cooperation fell. Resource-sharing initiatives that had stalled for decades suddenly moved forward. The practical benefits became impossible to ignore, even for the most skeptical traditionalists. The success wasn't just diplomatic, it was measurable in improved living standards and expanded opportunities for both species. Other species requested access to the sensory translation protocols. The Vorlax Collective inquired about implementing them for their negotiations with aquatic species. The Regalian Consortium wanted adaptations for their gaseous form delegates. The protocols became diplomatic tools in their own right, bridging communication gaps that had hindered interstellar relations for generations. Demand grew faster than Marcus and Lily could manage the training sessions. Marcus became chief xenobiological consultant for the Kepler sector. His appointment recognized the value of his unconventional approach to interspecies communication. The position gave him authority to implement changes across multiple diplomatic stations. He found himself reviewing everything from environmental systems to culinary preparation protocols, ensuring they accommodated diverse biological needs. His work shifted from theoretical research to practical application on a sector-wide scale. Lieli's ambassadorship became permanent with expanded responsibilities. She now advised on all major interspecies negotiations within the sector. Her insights into human behavior proved valuable beyond the human-Alaran relationship. She helped mediate conflicts between species that had previously communicated only through formal channels. Her approach demonstrated that understanding cultural context mattered as much as understanding political positions. They co-authored papers on emotional intelligence in interspecies relations. Their research provided theoretical frameworks for what they'd discovered through practical experience. The papers became standard reading in diplomatic training programs across multiple species. They offered strategies for building trust where formal protocols often failed. The work established emotional intelligence as a legitimate field of diplomatic study, rather than just a peripheral consideration. Love and science fused to create lasting peace. Their personal connection became the foundation for professional breakthroughs that transformed sector politics. The combination of empirical research and genuine understanding produced results that neither could have achieved separately. Their relationship demonstrated that the most advanced diplomacy sometimes required acknowledging the human and alien elements that formal protocols often ignored. The new approach didn't eliminate all conflicts or misunderstandings. Some species remained cautious, some delegates resistant, but it created alternatives where previously there had been only rigid protocols or outright hostility. The sector became more stable not because everyone agreed, but because they had better tools for understanding their disagreements. The changes started small, a modified handshake protocol, a better cup of coffee, but eventually reshaped how multiple species interacted. Their blueprint proved that sometimes the most effective diplomacy happens through connection rather than negotiation. It showed that trust could be built across even the widest cultural gaps when approached with both scientific rigor and genuine curiosity. The harmony they achieved wasn't perfect, but it was real, built on the understanding that differences don't have to divide when you make the effort to truly understand them. Harmony Station finally lived up to its name 6 months after the mask came off. Systems that had once seemed temperamental now operated with smooth efficiency, the constant adjustments and recalibrations giving way to stable operation. The air recycling maintained optimal conditions without sudden shifts. The lighting provided consistent illumination without unexpected dimming, and the atmospheric pressure held steady across all sectors. The station felt less like a machine fighting itself and more like an environment designed for living. Some delegates still occasionally glanced at Lyellie's ears strangely. The looks were less frequent than before, less charged with suspicion, but they still happened. A quick sideways glance during meetings, a brief pause in conversation when she turned her head. The reactions had shifted from alarm to curiosity, from distrust to quiet fascination. The pointed ears no longer triggered security protocols, but they still drew attention in a station where most biological variations were carefully documented. Trade agreements now benefited multiple species, including Regalian colonies. The economic impact became visible in increased shuttle traffic and expanded docking facilities. Resource-sharing initiatives that had stalled for years moved forward, creating stability across sectors that previously experienced shortages. The practical benefits of cooperation became impossible to ignore, even for those who remained skeptical about interspecies relationships. Prosperity became its own justification for continued collaboration. The architecture improved to accommodate different physiological needs. Doorways widened for larger species, atmospheric controls allowed finer environmental adjustments, and lighting systems offered broader spectrum options. These weren't temporary modifications, but permanent features designed into new construction. The station evolved from a human-centered facility to a truly multi-species environment where diversity was built into the infrastructure rather than added as an afterthought. Vort Hack, once skeptical, now proposed joint research initiatives. The change in his approach was noticeable in meeting transcripts and project proposals. Where he had previously questioned interspecies collaboration, he now actively sought Alaran input on technical challenges. His shift from critic to collaborator demonstrated how practical results could overcome initial reservations. The joint initiatives produced innovations that neither species could have developed alone. The coffee replicator became famous across 3 sectors. Its perfected formula attracted visitors from distant stations who wanted to experience the legendary brew. The machine maintained its consistency while occasionally surprising users with particularly excellent batches that became station legends. Its reputation grew through word of mouth, a small but significant symbol of what cross-species cooperation could achieve when focused on solving everyday problems. Marcus sometimes found poetry from life support in his morning reports. The verses appeared between status updates and system readings, 3-line compositions about atmospheric balance and environmental harmony. He saved them in a private file, noticing how they gradually improved in meter and metaphor. The AI's attempts to articulate the relationship between function and beauty became a quiet background element of station operations, appreciated by some and ignored by others. Cooperation became the default rather than the exception. Meetings began with shared objectives rather than defensive positions. Problems were approached as technical challenges rather than interspecies conflicts. The shift was subtle but pervasive, visible in everything from maintenance schedules to research priorities. The station's culture transformed from cautious coexistence to active collaboration, creating an environment where trust was assumed until proven otherwise. The changes accumulated gradually, each small improvement building on the last until the station operated with an efficiency that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. The harmony wasn't perfect. Occasional misunderstandings still occurred, some species remained cautious. But the overall direction was clear. What had begun as a diplomatic experiment had become a functioning reality, proving that cooperation could become habitual, given enough time and tangible results. They stood together in the dim observation deck, watching the star-dusted blackness swirl beyond the transparent aluminum. The station's rotation brought a slow, stately procession of suns and nebulae into view, a silent spectacle they'd watched together many times before. It was Lylie who broke the comfortable silence, her voice a soft counterpoint to the vast quiet of space. She didn't look at him when she asked, her silver eyes fixed on the passing stars. "How does it feel," she said, "to be yourself?" The question hung between them, simple and profound. It didn't ask how he felt about their work, the station, or even her. It inquired about the one thing he'd never truly considered, his own state of being. For a man who quantified everything, who reduced emotion to data points and trust to a series of verifiable actions. The query was utterly disarming. It implied a before and an after, suggesting he hadn't been fully himself until recently, and the tension in that implication was unmistakable. Marcus let the silence stretch, considering. He thought about his life before her arrival, the sterile lab, the precise routines, the emotional distance he maintained like a vital life support system. His scientific detachment hadn't just been a methodology, it had been a shield, a way to engage with the universe without ever being truly touched by it. He'd hidden behind data streams and protocols, creating a persona of absolute objectivity that felt safer than vulnerability. He realized, with a clarity that was both jarring and peaceful, that he had been wearing a mask as surely as she had. Hers was ceramic and technology, designed for diplomatic accommodation. His was fashioned from empirical rigor and emotional reserve, designed for personal protection. Both were tools for managing how they were perceived, for controlling the messy, unpredictable nature of genuine connection. The parallel was so obvious now it felt like something he should have documented in a report. Being himself, he discovered, meant accepting the paradox. It meant valuing the hard data from his sensors, while also trusting the unquantifiable feeling of her hand in his. It meant maintaining his scientific standards while making room for the emotional resonance that made their work meaningful. The rational analysis wasn't wrong. It was just incomplete without its human counterpart. True understanding required both the graph and the feeling it represented. The biofield between them, usually a soft glow, began to pulse with a complex, harmonious light. The patterns weren't the simple indicators of stress or calm he'd learned to recognize. This was something deeper, a silent communication that transcended their separate biologies. It registered a mutual understanding that needed no translation, a resonance that felt like coming home. The air around them seemed to warm slightly, charged with a quiet energy. As if in response, the station's lights along the observation deck dimmed by precisely 15%. The change was subtle, almost imperceptible, but significant. It wasn't a malfunction or a scheduled adjustment. It was the environment itself offering a respectful acknowledgement of the moment, the integrated Alaran systems responding to the profound shift occurring within one of its inhabitants. The dimming created a more intimate space, a silent witness to a personal revelation. Authenticity became their shared language in that quiet starlit space. It was a tongue they had both been learning separately, through trial and error, and were now beginning to speak together fluently. It required no special protocols or translation matrices. It was simply the courage to be seen, fully and without reservation, and the grace to offer the same acceptance in return. The stars continued their slow march across the viewport, indifferent witnesses to the small, significant revolutions that happen in the quiet spaces between people. Their relationship became the quiet engine driving galactic cooperation. What began with a removed mask now influenced trade agreements across 3 sectors. The coffee replicator hummed in the background, its perfected brew a testament to how small understandings create large changes. One moment of authenticity had altered countless interactions between species, proving that trust could bridge even the widest divides. The station systems maintained their harmonious operation, the poetry of life support weaving through daily operations, as a reminder that connection matters as much as function. Some revolutions happen quietly,